Okay, so today I'm going to talk about working as a quality analyst, working as specifically around being an agile QA in the software development lifecycle. So this is some of the topics that we're going to cover for today. Hopefully, I can kind of get through everything. Um, if it becomes a lot or if you have questions, feel free to stop me and ask questions because I love answering questions, and that kind of helps me dig deep into the right topics that I can share so you can better understand the QA role or the stuff that we do as a QA. Oh, let me go back. So the topics that we're going to cover is basically what is a QA, the role as a QA in the software development lifecycle, things to think about while you're building out a test strategy, and what does testing actually look like for a QA. So I could do a quick introduction into who I am. Um, So I am a quality analyst. I currently work for Dilexa. I started my tech career all the way back in 2013. Um, didn't have a college degree. I was actually a computer science dropout. I tried to go to Prairie State in Chicago Heights, and I remember joining in the first semester, and I couldn't afford books. I couldn't afford $500 to pay for my books, and I tried to like copy off of other people, and like I was just falling behind, and I ended up dropping out. And I want to say I don't even know, like maybe like 7-ish years later, I ended up finding a internship called Icy Stars that kind of um it helped me learn what it was like to work on a product and work with a team. And I was able to kind of grow my tech career from there. And what I can say about myself is that I specialize in improving online and digital chaos for the people who manage it. I tend to go back and forth from working as a quality analyst to working as tech support for a lot of small businesses. And I ended up finding this space where I ended up teaching a lot of different concepts, whether that is social media marketing or web design or even skills that you can learn as a quality analyst. I ended up teaching these things to a lot of marginalized and underprivileged groups. Um, let's see. Okay, so we're going to get right into it. So, what is a QA? So, when you're out in the field, you will hear either a QA, or even in my current job, we're called QEs, or you'll even hear something called a tester. And these different titles can mean completely different things. But the general definition of a QA is an individual who is responsible for applying the principles and practices of software quality assurance throughout the software development lifecycle. They evaluate products, systems, and software to ensure that they are free of defects, or as free as we can get. You got to be careful with the free of defects because we're not machines. Things will come through, and but we make sure we get as close as we can to being free of defects and meeting the quality standards of the organization. So something that I do want to call out, there are different titles when it comes to being a QA, whether it's a QE, a tester, a quality analyst. The biggest thing that I tell people when they're looking for work as a QA is have a really good understanding of what an agile team is versus a waterfall team, because on the job, your day-to-day task will be completely different depending on if you're working with an agile team versus a waterfall team. And here I kind of get a little bit into what that means. So agile performs testing concurrently with software development, where we're building small slices of of the huge product. We're building small slices, and we're also testing while developers are building. So that way we can catch things really quickly as new pieces of functionality are being built out. Whereas in waterfall methodology, testing comes after the build phase. So um, they'll come up with a business requirements document in the beginning where business analysts will work with the client or they'll work with stakeholders to kind of talk through everything that a product may need. And we could take an example like Facebook and how we use Facebook can be considered a product. So business analysts will meet with the stakeholders of Facebook, or well, Facebook's kind of huge. Like let's say just logging into Facebook. They might meet with those stakeholders and gather a bunch of requirements that allow people to log into Facebook. Then they will pass that document down to a team of developers, and the developers will take a very long time just building out all these different pieces of logging into Facebook. And in Waterfall, the QA comes after the developers got done building all of these features for logging into Facebook. The QAs will come in last and then test everything that was built. And I don't want to down companies that do waterfall. Like it does work for some super large enterprise companies because they've been doing it for a long time. But sometimes in that waterfall process, it it becomes very tedious. It takes a very, very long time to get that product out because when QAs are testing, they're testing for weeks at a time and they're finding a bunch of issues and they're documenting all those issues and they have to send it back to the beginning of that process for developers to fix all those things that they found. And that process can take months, like a really, really long time. Whereas agile development, we're releasing small bits and pieces at a time, and those small bits and pieces are going to production way faster. So let's see. So in project development requirements, Agile allows changes also in project development requirements, whereas Waterfall has no scope of changing since the requirements once the project development starts. So another benefit of Agile is because we get to have small pieces that were tested pushed out into production, we can see what it's like for the user. And if any major changes need to happen, we can quickly make those changes in agile development. Where in waterfall, it takes forever for it to even get out into production. So if we need to change anything major, we will have to start that process all over again, where we're creating the business requirements document, and then it's going through development, and then it's finally getting to testing. So here are more benefits of being a agile QA. So it allows detecting any bugs in early stage development and uncover any gaps in requirements. So this is one of the pieces that I personally love about being a QA versus a tester. So in Waterfall, QAs are usually testers, and in Agile, QAs are usually QAs. We're analysts, and I take that analyst role very seriously when I'm on a team. And I've been pushing this agenda to a lot of companies that I work for called shifting left. And shifting left means during that software development lifecycle, when we are building out pieces of functionality, it goes through different, and I'm going to end up throwing some terms out there that you may have heard of, you may not have heard of, but feel free to ask questions if you don't understand the term that I'm using. But when we're working on different stories, they go through different swim lanes. They go through a backlog. They go through grooming. They go through oh my God, I am blanking out on these swim lanes, which is super important. They go through in dev, they go through testing, they go through approval, they go through all these different stages. And for a QA, I really, really push for QAs to work with business analysts, work with developers, go into the meetings where we're doing grooming, because we're able to, before we even put our hands on a computer to test the software, we're able to get into conversations where we're talking about what's going to be built, and we have a good understanding of how it's going to impact the existing system, and we're able to talk to people about the risk that may come up, or different things that we have to consider testing when certain pieces are being built. And having those conversations catches so many things so early. Like having early conversations about, like, for example, going back to Facebook and logging in a waterfall situation, they might not think about things like security until way later in the process. But in Agile, when if we're looking at login and we're looking at different functionality of logging into Facebook, we can have a conversation about performance. We can have a conversation about security and authentication and what does that look like for logging into Facebook. And the sooner that we have those conversations, the better that it is for the developers to build out what's needed. And they're thinking about security. They're thinking about what's a big one that people, accessibility is a big one that people miss all the time. And QAs can have that conversation early on so we can test with screen readers and we can make sure that everything is good so the company doesn't get fined like these ridiculous fines that they get fined for not having these things as needed. So that's one of the huge benefits, is just catching these bugs way early in the process before we actually test the product. And then also developers and QAs, and I would even throw in business analysts, DevOps, um, product owners, like all members of the team should be working together when it comes to things like exploratory testing and analyzing all the different risks that could come with building out a product. And also, QAs can provide rapid continuous feedback. So that's something that I spoke to before, just having lots of conversations about what can go wrong with what we're building, or not even what could go wrong, but like what should we be keeping an eye on as we're building out stuff. We should constantly be having more conversations. I honestly believe we should have more conversations than actually hands-on testing, because those conversations can prevent a lot of stuff that could come down the pipeline. So sorry if it's a lot of text. I kind of just crammed everything in here. So now I'm going to talk about the roles and responsibilities in the daily task of being a QA. So one of the things that we do is we develop and execute test plans to make sure, to ensure that all objectives are met. We implement and monitor test scripts to assess functionality, reliability, performance, and quality of the service or product. So these two pieces alone can look different depending on who you work for. For example, when I worked for ThoughtWorks, we didn't do a lot of documentation because we believed in having a lot more conversations about what was going on than to have documentation. Because what we saw was a lot of people got caught up in documentation that they weren't actually being hands-on on the actual product. They were just making sure like the documentation was up to date, and a lot of things were slipping through when we're not having those conversations and we're not doing things like desk checks, but we're just focusing on documentation. Whereas with Dilexa, the current company that I work for, they are really big on test scripts and test plans because we're working with a bunch of different teams overseas and within the company, and their only line of communication might be that documentation that we have. So this really varies on the company that you're working for. Also, our daily tasks can be identify and remedy defects within the production process. So catching those bugs and making sure that we're communicating the bugs that we're catching to make sure that we have minimal bugs in production. We recommend, implement, and monitor preventative and corrective actions to ensure that quality assurance standards are achieved. So something that I personally do with the teams that I work with is usually a QA would do, and we'll get into this a little bit later, a QA would do a test strategy on their own. And usually they'll come to the team and they'll say, okay, this is my strategy. This is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to test. What I personally like to do is bring my team together and have us do that test strategy together. I realized over the years, a lot of us, whether we're a developer, whether we're a QA, we all have different experiences with testing, and all of those experiences are valid and valuable. And a developer may have experiences with testing that I have never may have never came across, and I may have had experiences while testing that my team has never come across. So I like to bring everybody together and really talk through what does testing look like for our entire team. So more roles and responsibilities and daily tasks. So we compile and analyze statistical data. So we do run a lot of automations. We do look at a lot of numbers. We do look at um, performance testing, and we are analyzing data when it comes to how many tests are failing, um, how many tests are flaky tests, like what are the numbers when it comes to our performance. We're analyzing that stuff, and we're taking it back to the team to see what can we improve on the project. We also ensure that user expectations are met during the testing process. So this is really, really big for a QA. At the end of the day, we are trying to make a great experience for the end user. If the end user cannot use our products, then we have failed. We have failed at building out our application. So we have to make sure that when we are looking at stories and we're testing things out, we're constantly thinking about what is this like for the end user. We also draft quality assurance policies and procedures. I have personally not drafted a lot of policies. I believe the most documentation I have done is a test plan, a test strategy, and test cases. Again, it may depend on the company that you work for. You may have to do this type of task. Investigate customer complaint and product issues. So again, depending on the company that you work for, I worked for a company about 2 years ago called Grayshore, and I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to collaborate with UX designers, which funny enough is rare for QAs. It's rare for us to collaborate with UX designers because like we're kind of doing two different things, but we're kind of doing similar things at the same time. Like if for QAs, we're thinking about the user perspective when we're testing, and for UX, they're thinking about the user perspective when it comes to using the application. And while working for Grayshore, I was able to collaborate with them and talk with the actual end users and hear them talk through what their process is and have them show us what it looks like and the things that they're thinking about when they're using the application. And having that experience can shift the QA's thinking of how this application is actually being used. Because I could use this application as as somebody who has had tech experience for 10 years. But if we're building, again, going back to Facebook, if we're building something for Facebook, I may not know what that experience is like. Like I might not use Facebook at all. I might use Twitter all the time. So seeing somebody use Facebook and they might use biometrics to log in instead of a password, or they might use two-factor authentication every time they log in instead of just trusting the internet gods to log in. Having that perspective helps QAs tremendously because we're able to look into the right things when we're testing the end product. And we also ensure ongoing compliance with quality and industry regulatory requirements. This one is a big one. Early in my career, I fell behind on this, but then later in my career, I was like, oh, this is super important because this is money. This is where companies run into issues where they have to pay these huge fines, and I need to be aware of what that looks like. So this is the different agile ceremonies that we participate in. This may be super familiar for you. And I'm going to go back and forth between my notes so I can kind of read off each one. So here we have sprint planning, daily stand-up, sprint review, sprint retrospective. And I'm using sprint a lot. This can change depending on who you work for. When I worked for ThoughtWorks, they were more agile than sprint, which is two different, like there's agile, sprint, Kanban, all kinds of things. So I'm using sprint here, but the name might be slightly different if you work for a more agile company. So sprint, retrospective, product backlog grooming, inception, kickoffs, desk checks. So let me find my notes really quick. Okay. So let me know if you still see, do you still see the presentation?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So we're going to go into sprint planning. So sprint planning, the purpose of sprint planning is to define what can be delivered in the sprint and how that work will be achieved. Sprint planning is done in collaboration with the whole Scrum team. So one note that I would add to sprint planning is um, during this time, developers may do an estimation and they try to come up with a number or a system that kind of emphasizes whether or not um, this thing that they're going to be building is going to be easy to do or is going to be super duper difficult. And in the beginning of my career, when I didn't really know much, I didn't participate much in the sprint planning because I'm like, okay, this is a developer thing and they're trying to figure it out. But then what I realized through huge mistakes that was happening on the team is we would plan for a piece of functionality to be super easy for the developers to do. But then we realized later on to test this super easy piece of functionality is super duper hard to do. And we need like different systems. We need to mock certain things. And it becomes this like really long 4-day, 5-day, 2-week long process just to test this little piece of functionality. So within sprint planning, I started to participate more, and I encourage other QAs to participate in sprint planning and have developers think about testing when it comes to estimating the stories and seeing whether or not this piece of work is super quick and easy to do or if it's going to take time. Consider testing when it comes to that time. So daily stand-up, you may have heard of already. It's a stand-up meeting where attendees typically participate while standing. Now we're virtual, so we're sitting on computers. We discuss what was accomplished the day before. We plan for the day, any blockers that we may have that are preventing us from working on a particular task. Something else that I would note on a daily stand-up, depending on the company that you work for, depending on the team that you're on, I encourage a little bit more than a stand up because sometimes we get through a stand up and we're just saying like the high level of what's going on. But when it comes to testing and development, you may have a secondary stand up called a dev huddle or a tech huddle where if we want to get more technical and we want to get more detailed into what we're doing, or if we need help with something, we're able to get a little bit more technical without holding up other people who may need to go about their day. So, so those for me are really essential to have because even if it's too technical for me, I can still participate in the meeting and get a heads up on what's going on and do and gather the resources and the research that I need to make sure that I'm good to test whatever is coming up. So there's also a sprint review. So the purpose of the sprint review is to inspect the outcome of the sprint and determine future adaptations. So this can be called a demo. This could be called a showcase. It's different depending on who you work for. So a retrospective is a reoccurring meeting held at the end of a sprint used to discuss what went well during the previous cycle and what can be improved for the next sprint. And these are really essential. It's really essential to have, not only to kind of improve the work that we're doing, but then also get a good heads up. And this is my mental health code burnout coming in. But I really encourage people to talk about their mental health during a retrospective. Being in this line of work is very intense. It is long hours. It is us straining our brains on computers all day. It is us working nonstop to get these products, especially when a deadline is approaching or we're getting a lot of pressure to get something done. It could be a lot and it could take its toll. You may come across something called a death march. I have come across many of those where we are staying up to 9 o'clock at night trying to push something through. And even at Dilexa, we did a push to production that was literally overnight. And we had to stay up to 2 a.m., 3 a.m. to push this thing to production because we had a team that was overseas that we had to work with. And factoring in all these things, I feel like a retrospective should be more than just what we're building. It should also be a a good way to see how we're doing mentally, physically, and just making sure that our team members are okay. Because at the end of the day, we're people, not machines. Um, so then there's product backlog grooming. Backlog grooming is just a regular session where backlog items are discussed, reviewed, and prioritized by product managers, product owners, and the rest of the team. The primary goal of backlog grooming is to keep the backlog up to date and ensure those backlog items are prepared for upcoming sprints. So one of the things that I talked about early on is things in the application may change, and with those changes, some of the items that are coming up in the backlog may be irrelevant. So just going through backlog grooming can help remove stuff that's no longer relevant to our project and just kind of keeping an eye on what's coming up. And as a QA, we can look at these backlog items and just kind of mentally prepare for what's coming up. So as we're testing the current stuff that's in the pipeline, we can kind of foresee what's coming and like prepare our test plan or prepare our the way that we're testing for the things that are coming. So then there's inception. People like to keep QAs out of inception. I fight against this like with my soul. I encourage QAs to be in inception because if you want to get the heads up, this is the heads up. The inception is a workshop, is an important ceremony that we usually hold at the beginning of a project, which creates transparency and provides heads up for the whole team on what they will be focusing on during sprint 0. And I feel like for a QA, just having our presence in inception, especially if they know that you're at a QA, this has happened to me a million times. Sometimes I don't have to say anything in the meeting. Usually just me sitting in the meeting and people are talking about something. They look at me and they're like, oh crap, testing. And they immediately start thinking about testing. And I'm like, yes, I did my job. They're thinking about it. Yes, think about testing. When you see me, think about testing. And that's why I kind of encourage QAs to be in inception, because for a lot of businesses, even still today on Beyonce's internet in 2023, companies are still thinking of testing as an afterthought. And it pains me when they do that. So just being involved in inception and being like, oh, think about testing kind of helps people see it ahead of time, because it can open up a can of worms that nobody really knew about. They could be like, oh yeah, testing. We just make this team out in Russia do the testing. And we're like, okay, what? Like, no, we need to talk about this and figure out, okay, how do we work with them? Who do we need to talk to out there? So like going to inception, you will find out that there's so many gaps and so many things that you have to like pay attention to as a QA to take note of as we're building this application out. And then there's the day-to-day. So there's kickoffs. So kickoffs is a chance for, usually it's a dev, if you're lucky, a business analyst, and a QA. And usually those three will meet together and they'll align on priorities and kind of establish a vision for what the developers are going to be working on and what we're going to be testing. So usually there's ACs that there's a description of what we're building. So like for a login, we could say, okay, this piece of functionality we're building, we want the user to be able to put in their email and put in a password to access their account. So we will put that description on a story. We would talk through the ACs, which is acceptance criteria. And this is key for QAs because this is the main thing that we're going to be testing. So we'll agree on what those ACs are. And then we'll kind of talk through, okay, is there stuff that we need to look out for? Is Facebook working with Okta? Do we need to have a phone to test this? All of this should come out. It should come out way ahead of time. But if you don't catch it early on, then during a kickoff, a QA can have the opportunity to talk through how they're going to test this. And as they're talking through it, a developer can pay attention to what that QA is saying and be like, ah, okay, so I know they're going to test for this. So let me make sure when I'm building that I can look out for that scenario. So when we do our desk check and the QA goes through the ACs, then we'll have those checked off and completed. So then that goes into the other one that I want to go to, which is desk checks. So after we review the feature, the story, and we talk through it with a business analyst and the developer gets done working on it, we meet again and we're like, okay, this piece of work is done. Let's test through the ACs. Show me what you built. Let's try out a few things and see if we're good. And once a QA is like, okay, I think we're good, then a QA would take on that piece of work and then start testing. So let's see. So now we're going to go into the test strategy and let me know if I'm good on time. I just realized I just kept talking and talking and talking. So I want to do a check-in if anybody has any questions or if I'm good on time, I can just like keep going.
Yeah, you can keep going.
Okay, awesome. So now we're going to go into the test strategy. Test strategy. So usually a QA would kind of do this on their own, depending on the company that they work for. What I like to do is do a workshop, and the workshop that I do is almost like retro style. So we'll have like a board and different categories of that test strategy. So I could be like, okay, what type of tests are we doing, or what is your definition of testing, or what tools are we considering for testing? And I would have the team come together and they share what has worked for them. They share their thoughts around it, what's worked for them, and they share any questions they may have about these things. And I usually do like a 1 hour workshop for this, but every time I do it, I guarantee the conversations are so great in these workshops that we end up having like 2, 3, 4 meetings just to talk about our test strategy and how we're testing. So here are some key things that I put into my test strategy, and this can be adjusted depending on what works for you as the QA. You may work for companies where you may not do desk checks and kickoffs for whatever reason. So you can adjust your strategy to that. Or you may have a team of QAs where literally my last project, it was 8 of us. And I was like, what are we doing? Like, okay, you got automation, you got this, I got this, I got that. So it really depends on who you're working for. This document can change. And what I tell QAs is make this strategy work for you. This is your strategy. This is your thought process when you're going into a team. This is how you want to strategize and work with your team. So one of the main things, one of the most important things that you should consider while making this document, what is the goal? What is the goal? I have come across clients where they were testing, they just wanted documentation that a test strategy existed. Like nobody was going to read it, but they just wanted to know that it exists. So the type of test strategy document I would make for that type of client will literally be the standards. Like this is what a QA does, and this is what we're testing, and literally just hand that over. Whereas on other teams that I've been on, the goal of the document might be for actual understanding. Like the developers might need to know, okay, how are we testing this thing? So I give them my perspective of what I'm going to be doing when I'm working on this team. So it can adjust how I'm building this thing out depending on what the goal is. So like, is it for a stakeholder? Is it for a team? Is it for you to know what you're doing? This document is yours. It's a living, breathing document. So it should be adjusted as needed. The next thing that I go into in my test strategy, which this is important, especially when you are working with stakeholders, because a company is going to have their own idea of what a tester is. And because I'm a consultant, 9 times out of 10, I'm coming into a situation where they do not know what an agile QA is. They have their perspective of what a tester is, but they don't have their perspective of how agile QAs really work. So in this document, this is where I list it out. I call it out. This is what makes me different from the rest. So this is where you can set your expectations of your role on a team. Sometimes when we go on a project, we have a set idea of what we need to do as a QA, and there's a set of expectations that our stakeholders may have, and there's a set of expectations that our actual team may have, which is why I go back to the workshop that I do, because I want to know what my team is expecting of me before I get started. Because I've been in situations where I would test how I normally would test, and then a developer would be like, oh, so you don't do this, this, and that. And I was like, no, sometimes I do it, but for this, I felt like I didn't need to do it. And then that ends up being a conversation, whether it comes up during retrospective, where it comes up during other conversations. It's a moment where we can come together and kind of talk through, okay, what are the expectations? What's needed? What is actually needed from our team? Because if there is a gap, then we have to figure out how to cover that gap. So one thing that you can do with understanding your role is you could talk to your team. You could also talk with your tech lead, your project manager, and the whole team to kind of talk through what are those expectations. So another thing that we get into is the team quality practices. What are some things that we're doing as a team to help ensure quality? So I strongly believe that quality is the team's responsibility. It is not just the QA alone. This was something I had to fight in the beginning. Well, not fight, like I'm not sitting here like punching devs out, but but a lot of people do have um, those expectations of a QA, and some people will believe that I'm not going to worry about testing. That is just a QA. And at the end of the day, QAs are human. We can miss a lot of things. QAs have different experiences. So some QAs have experiences with code. Some QAs do not have experiences with code. So there's a lot of things that a QA who might have experience with code might be able to catch, where a more of a manual QA that doesn't touch code, they might not be able to catch. So you want to ensure that the whole team knows that this is a team responsibility. As developers, you want to think about how you're testing on a project, whether that is a manual check where you get done with your stuff, you push it to the repo, and you test it, and then hopefully you're testing it, and then push it to the repo. Or are you actually doing a test-driven development where you're writing the test first and then you're building around that test to make that test pass? So there's different ways that you could take on the responsibility of testing, whether you're a developer, a QA, a business analyst, a product owner, or not product owner, sorry, a project manager. Like everybody can have different responsibilities when it comes to testing. So in your test strategy, you can lay that out. You can put down, okay, a QA is responsible for these things. Developers are responsible for these things. So that way, if I'm a developer and I'm reading the test strategy, I could be like, okay, this is some of the things that I need to be thinking about when it comes to testing. So the goal of calling out those practices is to just lay out how the team can be more responsible for quality throughout the entire software development life cycle. Another biggie that I have come across in my 10 years of working in the tech space, everybody defines testing completely different. And this is why I ended up having that workshop, because of this reason. The number one thing I have had conversations about where people were getting mixed up, the number one thing, whether you were a developer, a tech lead, a QA, whatever role, the number one thing that I had to have conversations about is what is functional testing. Surprisingly, it is 50 different things to 50 different people. And we had a situation, I can't remember which company, I think it was Grayshore. We had a situation where everybody had a different definition of functional testing. And we had to have a conversation of what does automation look like. And this turned into the longest 2 months of my life, because we had to really sit and figure out, what do you consider functional testing? What do you consider functional testing? How are we going to go about this automation? And like we ended up doing the workshop because we just needed to flesh this out because a lot of people had different thoughts when it came to doing automation. So, defining testing, this is where you could call out the different types of testing that would occur on a team, define them, and use examples. The one thing I got feedback on when I did my workshop, I did my strategy, and I brought it back to the team. The number one thing that the dev team was thankful for was calling out, this is unit testing, this is integration testing, this is end-to-end testing. And I literally went in our code, took a screenshot, used an example of the code, put it in our strategy. It was like, this is an example. This is what it's going to look like. And they were so thankful for that, especially as new developers were coming on because they were having the same questions. So I called that out in the test strategy. And that's something that I do. Every QA doesn't have to do that. So the goal is to have a clear understanding of what levels of testing we're going to do on a project. Everyone should have the same understanding of the different types of testing that occur on a project. More about the testing strategy. So this is also a biggie. This is something that unfortunately comes up during development. Well, not during actual development, but like during the life cycle of a story. So calling out dependencies, calling out blockers, calling out risk. This is why I encourage QAs to be an inception, because this is where we're going to get the heads up. This is where you're going to find out, like, oh, we can push to production, but we got to go through staging, dev, QA, QA2, UAT, UAT2, all these different environments. And then we go through 2 weeks of UAT testing. We go through a month of backend testing. And then maybe we can go into production. This is where you find all of that stuff out. This is where you find out, like Inception, this is where you find out that the company was just fined for $5 million because they forgot to test with screen readers. Like, this is like Inception is where you find all of that stuff out. And in the test strategy, you want to call it out because people will forget, and then things come up, and then all of a sudden they're like, well, what happened to the tester? Why didn't it catch this? So you want to make sure that you're on top of these things and you're calling it out. So this varies depending on the project that you're on, the team members, access to the client. I've been on teams where I have never talked to a client a day in my life on the team. And these are things that can be blockers. These are things that can be dependencies. You may, as a developer, you may come across something that you're like, I don't know what to do with this. This looks a little weird. I need to talk to somebody about it. And you may need to have access. Well, usually your project manager can kind of get access, or your tech lead can kind of get access. But things like this can pop up during development, and things like this can pop up during testing. And also talking through the tech stack, the architecture. That was a challenge of mine in the beginning. It was a challenge of mine in the beginning, and now I'm trying to like dig into it. Learning the tech stack and the tech architecture of how data is being moved, how we're building out our application, having a good understanding of that alone is so beneficial for a QA. And you want to call that out, and you want to have those meetings with people who do understand, like, this is the tech stack we're going to go with, this is the architect, this is the design we're going to go with, and this is why we're going with this design. You want to get a heads up on those things, because there might be certain things in that system or that design that can be a problem later. I was on a team where we had to, like, we were working with a system where we had to do a service bus, and we were passing on messages to a database, and we couldn't, like, for some reason, we couldn't have access to that database, but we needed to mock out what that database would look like. And that affected how I was going to go about data testing. So just getting a heads up on what that architecture looks like and asking questions around it can save so many headaches. It can save you from so much pain. So you want to take all of this into consideration when you're building out a test strategy. So let's get testing. We're not going to actually test because that would take forever, but these are the different types of testing that you will come across as a QA. So acceptance testing. So a while ago, we talked about kickoffs and desk checks. And when we meet together with a developer and a business analyst, we are reading through a description of what that functionality looks like, but we're also looking at ACs. So those ACs may say, as a user, I want to put in my email address. As a user, I want to put in a password, or I'm using very horrible examples, but I'm using that for this example. So as a user, I want to submit and seed my profile. So these may be ACs, and then as a QA, this is part of my acceptance testing. I'm looking at those ACs and I'm testing those things out. So then there's regression. Regression testing is testing the existing software applications to make sure, regression testing is testing what's already been built. If we're building something, if we're adding some new piece of functionality to our application, we want to make sure that we're not breaking something that is already out in production. So you want to do regression testing to kind of test through old stuff that we may have already built ages ago. We're testing through it to make sure that we haven't broken anything that's existing, that's already out in production. Smoke test is just a preliminary check of the software after a build or before a release. Usually, this can be done either with automation or this can be done manually. I've seen both happen. Usually, when we're building out, when we're using our pipelines to push out code, whether it's to staging, whether it's to QA, whether it's to production. And these are different environments that replicate what's already out in the public. These different environments can replicate what's out in production. We may run smoke tests in between those environments to make sure that things are good. So then there's manual testing. This is a major part of what a QA would do. So like manual testing is the process of manually testing software for defects. It requires a tester or a QA to play the role of an end user where they use the application's features to ensure that it's doing what it's supposed to do. So sometimes a QA can have a test plan or test cases where they're literally having a checklist of things that they're looking for or things that they're doing, the expected the expected result, and just checking for inaccuracies and checking to make sure that everything's good. Also, depending on the QA that you work with, they may review the commits, the changes in code. I've looked at a lot of code to just make sure that I'm understanding, especially when it comes to, this is especially the case when it comes to API testing. When it comes to API testing, you can't really have a browser to test out of. You have to use tools like Postman and do a lot of testing, like whether it's to get a certain endpoint, whether it's to post to a certain endpoint. A lot of that stuff is going to require looking into code, making sure that we have the right collections and stuff, going through documentation and reading what's already existing to make sure that we're testing the right way. And that is also considered like manual testing. So we're making sure that all the requirements are met for the environment that we're testing in. Usually, we run into a lot of issues when it comes to different environments. They're supposed to look like production, but sometimes it's not the case. So we just want to make sure that everything's good with the environment that we're testing in, to make sure that it's not something that may have been from the feature that was built out. It might be something that's from the environment. We just want to make sure that all factors are good when we're testing. So that way, if we do find a bug, we want to be 100% sure that it's actually a bug. And then there's automation testing. So there are QAs that do strictly automation, and it's basically them writing code using certain languages and certain frameworks to build out test suites and just ensure that that these tests will pass, or that it's being actually helpful for the project that we're building. Usually the automation, sometimes the automation the automation, the test suites is separate from the actual code. We may have our own like code base that we're working from, and then we execute those tests to kind of catch things faster. Like for a QA is for small applications, for something like a personal website or a blog, that would be something that's considered easy for a QA to test. But if I was to actually have to go in and test Facebook, and I'm talking more than login, I'm talking profiles, I'm talking events, I'm talking business pages, I'm talking chatting, I'm talking their oh Jesus, what else do they have? Their lives, their shows, their watches, all that stuff. If somebody today was like, hey, you got to go in and test Facebook, I would cry. I would cry, especially if I had to test it manually. Automation will kind of help alleviate a lot of that pain and stress that I will be feeling testing Facebook. So automation is very, very useful. It's very, very helpful. But I would put out the message that a lot of companies get automation happy. They see a QA and they're like, I want automation testing. And we have to be like, but why? Why do you want it? So before people dive into automation testing, I really, really encourage to have the conversation of why do you need automation testing? Are you trying to prove that the application has zero bugs, or are you trying to improve the quality of the application that we're building? Really dig into that real reason of why you want automation testing. And then there's functional testing, end-to-end testing. This varies depending on who you're working with. So functional testing is a type of testing that seeks to establish whether each application feature works as per the software requirements. Each function is compared to the corresponding requirement and whether the output is consistent with the end user's expectations. So two things that I call out for this is, how are we defining functional testing for the team? How do we define it? Because the way I look at it and the way you look at it might be two different ways. And how do we know that we have a good functional test? Readable tests that are testing what we're building and has a certain input with an expected output. And then there's exploratory testing. I was really big on this early in my career because I didn't know what I was doing. So I'm like, I'm just going to click around and see what happens. But exploratory testing is an approach that you use for software testing that is described as simultaneously learning, test design, and execution. So we're exploring, and we're learning about this application, and we're just kind of testing different things out to see what it does. It focuses more on discovery. So it's not exactly like, I'm going to exploratory test and find this random bug. Sometimes that will happen. You'll find like a really random bug, and we usually call those like edge cases, or it might be an actual good case that needs to be brought to the team. But a lot of it is really big on just discovery, because as QAs, we need to know the ins and outs of this application so we can kind of get a heads up on things that can go wrong. So you really want to focus more on discovery and not just like, because some QAs will be like, my mission is to find all the bugs, and like I just want to bug and and I try to steer away from that, because a lot of people will see QAs in a more negative light, that we're just here to destroy a developer's day and like call out all the things that went wrong. And that's not our job. It's not our job to really do that. So I try to steer people away from being bug happy when it comes to exploratory testing. But it's really just discovering things and relying on how on the guidance of like the individual tester to uncover defects that might not be easily covered in the scope of other tests. And then there's also database testing. So testing is the process of checking that everything's in order in regards to the database, in regards to the database. This can be a thing on its own, whether you want to tackle it in small slices or tackling it by itself. Database testing is a huge thing. And if you come across a situation where you're dealing with a database, have a meeting and talk through how you're going to tackle this, because it can be a huge pain testing the database. So it's the process of checking that everything's in order in regards to the database. This can be done in a controlled testing environment. The process is known as backend testing or data testing. It involves checking things such as like schemas and tables. And you want to make sure, keep in mind when you're doing this type of testing, that the database remains in a consistent state. And this is probably one of the issues that I have run into as a QA. Um, oof, you would be surprised how many companies we trust that have the most out of whack database, and how they're like, you ever get those emails that's like, your stuff has accidentally been leaked, da, 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 because some of these databases are trash. Like, they're trash. So yes, things are leaking everywhere. So you want to make sure that when you're building out something, that the database is in a consistent state, that you're being very careful with people's data, especially if you're dealing with personal identifying data. You want to be super duper, like, have all the meetings. If you're dealing with people's personal information, have all the meetings that you could possibly have with all the people to make sure that the data is good. You also want to make sure that you want to be aware that changes are expected to persist even if there are failure. Test for consistency in favor of availability and partition. And I think that is all I have for database testing. Let's see what else. Oh, so there's other things before I get into the last thing. I didn't add it on here, but I could talk a little bit more about it. So when it comes to testing, we're, as a QA, we're not just only worried about functional testing. There's a lot of other things we have to consider too. Um, and this is why it's important to be an inception, because you want to understand the resources that you have available to you on a team. There's been some projects where I had resources for accessibility. Like, they had, especially if they're an airline company, not to call anybody out, but like, if they're an airline company, they should be really big on accessibility, and sometimes they're not. Luckily, the team that I was working with, they had resources around accessibility, and they had devices and stuff that we could use. And you want to be aware of that ahead of time. And there might be situations where you don't have certain resources to rely on. So if you fall into a situation where you don't have additional resources to rely on, you as a QA need to figure out how to get through these certain things and find out if you can get resources for this type of stuff. And those things that I'm referring to are things like accessibility testing and non-functional, specifically non-functional requirements. So how do I word this? So on most companies, so some the stuff that are listed on here is security, accessibility, load performance testing, penetration, and vulnerability testing. If you are lucky as a QA, some companies will have separate teams that handles these type of testing. You want to have that conversation as early as possible, because if you find yourself in a situation where they do not have this, where they don't have people testing for security, they don't have people testing for accessibility, they don't have people testing for performance and vulnerability, you want to have some conversations very, very quickly with people to make sure that this is covered somehow, some way, because that can fall back on the team if we didn't think about these things. Another thing that's really, really big is compliance and security testing. How the team is defined, Terraform compliance, industry defined. Those are things that you also want to consider when it comes to testing. So I heard some, oh, I thought it was the chat for a second. Or maybe it is. Oh, okay, yes. Oh yeah, I went way over time. Okay, but that was it. Yay.
That's okay. Well, we're recording so people can watch the rest of it if they missed it. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions for Ahi?